On a warm June night in 2015, in the quiet suburbs of Jacksonville, Florida, a deadly silence hung in the air. The evening should have been uneventful, another ordinary night. But as the clock struck midnight, a sinister truth was slowly rising to the surface, concealed behind the walls of the Monroe family's carefully built life. Henry Monroe, a retired police officer, was the kind of man people looked up to. Known for his quiet strength and steady morals, he was respected in the neighborhood, a man whose presence still carried the authority of his years on the force. But now, in the dim light of his own living room, Henry lay slumped in his favorite chair, lifeless, a bullet wound to his chest. The police arriving at the scene suspected a botched robbery, the house slightly disheveled as if someone had rifled through it in a hurry. But as they moved cautiously around, it became clear that something felt off. For the Monroes, life had changed irreparably over the past few years, a fact no one knew better than Jessica Monroe, Henry's daughter-in-law. At 35, she was the glue that held her family together, the kind of mother who knew every detail of her children's days, from their favorite songs to their quiet fears. Her husband, Michael Monroe, was a successful real estate agent, well known in Jacksonville for his quick charm and flawless salesmanship. But Michael's work demanded his attention, and over the years, he had grown distant, his devotion to his career leaving Jessica to run the household alone. Michael's absences gnawed at Jessica, each day pulling her further into a cycle of loneliness she tried to ignore. While Michael attended late-night networking events, Jessica found herself filling the gaps left in his wake. It was during one of these absences that Henry, grieving the loss of his wife years prior, began seeking solace in Jessica's presence, their conversations easy and comforting. Henry's grief over his late wife's passing had left a wound that never fully healed, and Jessica's kindness provided him a much-needed balm. The bond they shared was innocent, at first, a shared understanding, a quiet camaraderie. Jessica often invited Henry over for dinners, their conversation flowing effortlessly over memories of the family, stories of his years on the force, and her own tales of raising his grandchildren. But over time, their connection deepened, a subtle shift neither could ignore. It was on a chilly December evening in 2009 that something between them changed forever. That night, as they sat side by side on the porch, Jessica wrapped a blanket around Henry's shoulders. Their eyes met, and for a moment, neither looked away. It was a fleeting look, but it held a spark, an unspoken understanding that left both feeling vulnerable, caught off guard. They quickly looked away, retreating back into the safe space of small talk. But the moment lingered, a seed planted in the shadows, growing quietly between them. This connection, once comforting, now haunted Jessica, pulling her toward an invisible line she knew she shouldn't cross. Every time she thought about it, guilt and excitement churned within her, a volatile mix that threatened to unravel everything she held dear. As time wore on, that single spark of connection between Jessica and Henry refused to die out. In fact, it only grew stronger, a persistent ache that neither of them could explain, much less control. Henry, who had always been stoic and unwavering, found himself thinking about Jessica in a way that disturbed and fascinated him. He knew better, of course, he was a man of integrity, and Jessica was his daughter-in-law, the mother of his grandchildren. And yet, there was something magnetic between them, something that seemed to pulse and grow stronger each time they were alone together. Jessica, too, found herself torn between shame and a strange thrill she couldn't entirely push away. Each time Henry visited, she would anticipate his arrival with a flutter in her chest, and she hated herself for it. She knew she was dangerously close to crossing a line that could ruin everything she had worked so hard to protect, everything she had sacrificed for her family. And yet, it was Henry's presence that had become a strange solace in her life, his understanding a quiet refuge in the absence of her husband's attention. Their connection deepened in 1,000 small ways, each of them subtle but unmistakable. An accidental brush of the hand here, a shared smile there, a lingering glance that neither could quite shake. Jessica would find herself glancing at the clock in the late afternoons, wondering if Henry would stop by for dinner, her stomach knotted with anticipation she struggled to ignore. She started going out of her way to make his favorite meals, finding excuses to linger in the kitchen with him after the others had left, their voices hushed in the warm glow of the dim kitchen lights. One evening, while her children were in bed and Michael was away on business, Henry stayed late. He had come over to fix a broken faucet in the kitchen, and when he finished, he and Jessica lingered in the quiet house, the silence between them heavy with the unspoken. Jessica handed him a glass of wine, and they sat across from each other at the kitchen table, their conversation dipping in and out of comfortable silence. They spoke about everything, about Henry's memories of his wife, about Jessica's dreams and disappointments, the details of her life she rarely shared with anyone else. There was an intimacy between them that felt both wrong and completely natural. As the clock ticked on, Jessica felt herself leaning closer, her voice softer, her gaze more intense. She could feel the tension simmering between them, palpable and undeniable. When their hands brushed across the table, neither of them pulled away this time. Jessica's heart pounded, her thoughts racing, every instinct screaming at her to stop. But in that moment, the urge to feel close to someone, to be understood and wanted, overwhelmed all rational thought. Henry's gaze lingered on hers, his eyes dark and conflicted. He reached out, his hand gently cupping hers, his touch sending a thrill through her that she couldn't suppress. There, in the dim light of the kitchen, with the silence of the house pressing down on them, they crossed that invisible line. Henry leaned in, his lips brushing hers in a tentative kiss that sent a shock through her. For a moment, time seemed to stand still, the rest of the world slipping away. It was only them, wrapped in a forbidden moment that held both of them captive. But as quickly as it began, it ended. Jessica pulled back, her breath catching, her face flushed with a mix of desire and horror. She stumbled to her feet, her hand flying to her mouth, unable to believe what had just happened. Henry, too, looked shaken, his expression filled with regret and something deeper, something that neither of them wanted to name. They didn't speak of it, didn't acknowledge what had just transpired, but both knew that nothing would be the same. That moment lingered, filling the space between them with a tension that grew more unbearable with each passing day. Each time Henry visited, Jessica would feel her pulse quicken, her thoughts tangling in a web of guilt and desire. She would catch herself glancing at him when she thought he wasn't looking, her mind betraying her heart betraying the vows she had made to her husband. In the months that followed, their encounters became more frequent, more charged. They found themselves meeting in places they wouldn't be seen, sneaking glances and fleeting touches that only fueled the fire they could not extinguish. Every touch, every stolen glance, was a reminder of the line they had crossed, the line they could never uncross. And yet, neither could resist. Their bond was no longer innocent, no longer a comforting presence in each other's lives. It was a secret, a dark and dangerous connection that could shatter everything if revealed. They were dancing on the edge of a precipice, fully aware of the consequences but too drawn to each other to stop. Over the months, Jessica and Henry's relationship grew into a secret life, each moment together more risky and electric than the last. They both knew the stakes, the utter disaster that would unfold if anyone found out, yet neither seemed able to stop. The thrill of their connection, its very forbidden nature, had wrapped around them like a vine, its grip tightening with each shared glance, each stolen touch. Their bond had transformed into something they couldn't control, and the risks were spiraling out of their grasp. Each time Jessica watched Henry walk up to her door, her heart would race, a mix of excitement and fear pressing down on her. It was no longer enough for them to exchange glances in her kitchen or to meet in the dim corners of her home. Their need for one another became relentless, pushing them into secrecy that went beyond the walls of the Monroe household. They began sneaking away to places far from prying eyes, where they could drop the pretense and give in to the pull that had overtaken both of them. One evening, while Michael was out of town on a business trip, Jessica and Henry met at a secluded cafe on the outskirts of the city. They sat in the corner, hidden in shadows, their voices low as they spoke, each word carrying the weight of what they couldn't say in daylight. The thrill of meeting in public, hiding in plain sight, was a dangerous temptation neither could resist. But as the minutes slipped by, Jessica felt a pang of fear prick at her thoughts. They were in a public place, where someone could recognize them at any moment. She glanced around nervously, her hand brushing Henry's under the table, her pulse quickening. Henry, too, felt the creeping dread of exposure. He knew the risks better than anyone, knew that the secrets they were keeping could shatter lives. He watched Jessica's face, saw the fear mirrored in her eyes, and yet, he didn't pull his hand away. It was a desperate connection, one they couldn't afford, yet it had become an addiction, an escape neither wanted to relinquish. As their meetings became more frequent, Jessica felt herself slipping into a world of lies she had never imagined. She had become adept at dodging questions, inventing reasons to leave the house, hiding her tracks from her husband and children. Each lie came with a price, the guilt settling like a weight on her chest. She could see the same shadows gathering in Henry's eyes, a haunted look that lingered whenever they were forced to part. But the connection between them was too powerful, too consuming to resist. Each time they tried to distance themselves, it only drew them closer together. The secrecy they once saw as a shield was quickly becoming a source of dread, a constant reminder of how close they were to losing everything. They knew the boundaries they were violating, the damage that loomed on the horizon if they were caught. And yet, with each touch, each whispered promise, they danced closer to the edge, testing the limits of their desire against the crushing reality of what they were risking. In the summer of 2010, their recklessness reached a new peak. They began meeting at a rundown motel in a distant part of the city, a place hidden enough to escape notice but far enough from home to pose its own dangers. Each trip there was a delicate operation. Jessica would leave under the pretense of running errands or meeting a friend, and Henry would check in under an alias, using cash to avoid a paper trail. The grimy walls of the motel room were a stark contrast to the lives they'd built back in Jacksonville, but in those hours together, they were free from the burdens of reality. One afternoon, after a long, tense week, Jessica found herself driving to the motel, her thoughts tangled in a web of anticipation and anxiety. She checked her phone compulsively, making sure there were no missed calls from Michael, no unexpected surprises waiting for her when she returned. As she parked in the gravel lot, she felt the weight of their choices pressing down on her, a mixture of guilt and desire that threatened to break her. But when she saw Henry's car parked nearby, the doubt faded, replaced by the thrill that only he could bring. In the room, they clung to each other like lifelines, each kiss, each touch a reminder of the dangerous path they were on. They knew they were playing with fire, that each meeting brought them closer to being discovered, but the fear only added to the allure, pulling them deeper into their twisted escape. They spoke about their lives, their regrets, their hopes for a happiness that seemed impossible to grasp. They knew it couldn't last, that their choices would catch up to them. And yet, neither could resist the pull, the way their connection seemed to drown out everything else. As they parted that afternoon, a lingering unease settled in Jessica's chest. She watched Henry walk away, his figure disappearing into the distance, and a cold dread wrapped around her. They were too entangled, too far gone to pull back now. As the affair between Jessica and Henry intensified, small details began to slip through the cracks, small enough to miss but large enough to be noticed by Michael Monroe. Michael wasn't a man who jumped to conclusions easily, but there was something about Jessica's recent behavior that left him unsettled. He would catch her glancing at her phone more frequently, smiling at texts she didn't mention, slipping out of the house with vague explanations about errands or meeting friends. At first, he chalked it up to her needing a break from the responsibilities of managing the household and the kids. But the patterns were too consistent, the secrecy too palpable. One evening, as Jessica returned home late, Michael noticed a distant look in her eyes, one he hadn't seen before. Her face was flushed, her posture tense, and when he tried to engage her in conversation, she seemed distracted, her mind clearly elsewhere. She offered him a quick smile and headed upstairs, leaving him alone in the living room with an uneasy feeling that refused to fade. He brushed it off, told himself he was reading too much into things. But as the days passed, the feeling grew. Michael's suspicions began to consume him, and he couldn't ignore the growing distance between them. He found himself scrutinizing every detail, noticing the subtle changes in her routine, the way she seemed to guard her phone a little more closely, glancing around before opening messages or making hurried calls. One night, while Jessica was in the shower, he picked up her phone, his hands hesitating over the screen. But she'd been careful, there were no incriminating texts or calls. Whatever she was hiding, she was covering her tracks well. Then, one afternoon, he stumbled upon something that sent a chill through him. Jessica had left her purse on the kitchen counter, a rare oversight for her. Michael, needing cash to pay the gardener, reached into her purse. His fingers brushed against something cold and unfamiliar. Pulling it out, he found a small, worn key, one he didn't recognize. It wasn't for their home, her car, or any lock he knew about. As he examined it, an uneasy feeling settled over him. Why would she have a key he'd never seen before? The following days were a haze of suspicion and paranoia. The thought of Jessica hiding something significant gnawed at him, every small detail now tinged with doubt. He observed her more closely, watched her as she made hurried excuses to leave the house, her demeanor shifting from tense to secretive. Still, he wasn't sure what he was dealing with, but he felt the pieces starting to align in a way that pointed to something he wasn't prepared to confront. Unable to shake the dread that had taken root in him, Michael decided to take a more drastic step. He contacted a private investigator, a former cop named Tom Grayson, who was known for his discretion and thoroughness. They met at a secluded diner on the outskirts of town, far from prying eyes. Michael explained his concerns, his voice laced with the weight of a man who felt his life slipping from his control. Tom listened quietly, nodding as he took notes, then assured Michael he would get to the bottom of it. The investigator's calm demeanor gave Michael a faint sense of relief, though the fear still gnawed at him, whispering that he might not want to know the truth. For the next week, Michael's anxiety mounted, each passing day a stretch of silence from Tom that only deepened his fears. He tried to act normal around Jessica, forcing himself to go through the motions, but the tension between them was undeniable. Jessica, sensing the change in him, became cautious, her behavior even more guarded. But Michael was past the point of caring, he needed answers. Then, one night, Tom finally called. His voice was calm but carried a note of urgency, asking Michael to meet him right away. Michael drove to the diner, his hands gripping the wheel tightly, his heart racing with dread. He arrived to find Tom waiting, a solemn expression on his face as he handed over a manila envelope. Inside were photographs, crisp, undeniable evidence of Jessica and Henry, his own father. Michael's world seemed to tilt on its axis as he flipped through each image, his heart pounding as he saw them together in various places, a quiet cafe, the driveway of a distant motel, their gazes locked in ways that left no room for misinterpretation. Each photo felt like a knife twisting in his chest, his mind reeling with the realization of the betrayal unfolding before him. He sat there in silence, the weight of the images pressing down on him, each one a reminder of the unimaginable truth that had been hiding in plain sight. His wife, the woman he thought he knew, and his father, together, conspiring behind his back in a deceit that shattered everything he'd once believed. The days after Michael discovered the photos were a blur of anger, betrayal, and a deep, gnawing need for answers. His world had been turned inside out, but he wasn't satisfied with mere images. He needed to know why his wife and his father had done this to him, and how long they had been slipping away together behind his back. The photos had given him proof, but now he wanted the details, the ugly truth hiding between the lines. Michael called Tom Grayson again, his voice trembling with a barely contained fury. He wanted to know everything Tom had learned, every sordid detail. The investigator met him at the same diner, a quiet, out-of-the-way place where they wouldn't be seen. Tom had a calm demeanor as he recounted the chain of events he'd uncovered, but each word hit Michael like a punch to the gut. Tom explained that Jessica and Henry had been meeting for years, their rendezvous stretching back to early 2010. It wasn't just the occasional stolen glance or fleeting touch, it was a full-blown affair, kept alive through secret meetings and elaborate lies. They had met at motels in distant parts of the city, always careful to keep themselves hidden, their actions cloaked in deceit that was as calculated as it was passionate. They used aliases, paid in cash, and avoided leaving any digital trail. Jessica would pretend to run errands or visit friends, and Henry would slip away from his quiet life as a grieving widower, vanishing into a world they had both constructed to sustain their hidden desires. Listening to Tom, Michael felt the familiar wave of betrayal wash over him, this time sharper, more tangible. Each word drove home the reality of the situation, revealing that the betrayal was far deeper than he had imagined. This was not a momentary lapse, not a one-time mistake. It was a long-running affair, a calculated series of betrayals by the two people closest to him. "What about my kids?" Michael's voice was barely more than a whisper as he struggled to contain his emotions. "Did they ever bring my kids into this? Did they?" Tom shook his head, his face somber. "No, as far as I can tell, they kept the children out of it. From what I gathered, they kept their encounters separate from family life, always hiding what they were doing. But make no mistake, Michael, they were playing a dangerous game. A dangerous game." The words echoed in Michael's mind, underscoring the double lives his father and wife had led, and the shameless lengths they had gone to keep their secret. He felt a white-hot rage welling up inside him, an urge to confront them both, to make them feel the pain they had so carelessly inflicted on him. But he forced himself to stay calm. There was something methodical, something cold within him that urged him to keep quiet, to play along, to gather his strength and plan his next move carefully. He decided to continue working with Tom, expanding the investigation to ensure he had every possible piece of evidence before taking any action. He didn't just want the truth, he wanted leverage, wanted the ability to take them down, to expose their treachery in a way they couldn't deny or escape. He knew that simply confronting them wouldn't be enough to satisfy the depth of his betrayal. He needed to destroy the illusion they had crafted, to strip away their secrets layer by layer until they were left with nothing but shame and regret. Over the following days, Tom followed Jessica and Henry closely, uncovering their routines, their carefully planned lies. He collected more photos, audio recordings, even tracking their interactions with others to see if anyone else was aware of the affair. Michael's anger simmered beneath the surface as he watched Tom piece together the twisted tapestry of his wife's and father's deception. His days became a haze of waiting and planning, his nights restless, his thoughts consumed by the images Tom sent him. They were reminders of the life he'd thought he'd built, now reduced to nothing more than an elaborate facade. One evening, Tom called him with an update, his voice tense. "Michael, there's something you need to see." They met at the diner, and Tom slid an envelope across the table. Inside were photos of Jessica and Henry outside a familiar-looking motel, their faces partially obscured but unmistakable. They were laughing together, their expressions so casual, so comfortable. The sight of their happiness together twisted the knife deeper into Michael's heart. His father and his wife, acting like nothing in the world could touch them, so blissfully unaware that their lives were unraveling right in front of them. Tom cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "There's more. I've dug into the finances a bit and found a trail of small withdrawals from Jessica's and Henry's accounts, spaced out but consistent. They're careful, but not careful enough. They've been using cash for these encounters, always just enough to cover motel stays and meals, never anything that would raise suspicion if you weren't looking closely." Michael nodded, his jaw clenched as he absorbed the information. The pieces were all there now, laid out in excruciating detail. Jessica and Henry's deception had become a routine, their affair woven into the fabric of their lives with his knowledge as the only missing thread. The depth of their betrayal was staggering, but Michael felt a cold clarity settling over him. He knew what he had to do. Michael had never known anger like this before. The fury had taken root deep inside him, growing stronger with each passing day, each piece of evidence Tom presented him. But now, he was ready. He wasn't going to wait another day, another hour. Jessica and Henry had stolen years from him, crafted their affair under his roof, around his children, and he could no longer keep silent. Tonight, he would make them face the truth they'd so meticulously hidden. That evening, as the house settled into its familiar nighttime stillness, Michael sat in the dimly lit living room, waiting for Jessica. When she walked in, he felt his anger swell, simmering beneath the surface as he watched her move, so unaware of what was coming. She gave him a polite smile, one that faded when she saw the tension in his face, the unyielding hardness in his gaze. She hesitated, confusion flashing across her face. "Sit down," Michael said, his voice low and tightly controlled. Jessica froze, but she complied, her gaze flicking nervously to his. She could feel the weight of his anger, the intensity of his stare, but she said nothing, waiting for him to continue. Without a word, Michael reached into his pocket and pulled out the manila envelope Tom had handed him just days before. He dropped it onto the coffee table in front of her, the photos slipping out slightly, enough for her to glimpse the truth hidden within. Her face drained of color as she saw the images of herself with Henry, meeting him at the motel, their faces close, laughing in a way that had once been reserved for her husband. Jessica's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with shock and horror. She reached out, her fingers trembling as she clutched the edge of the table, her entire body taut with fear. "Michael. I can explain," she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. Michael's laugh was bitter, cold. "Explain?" he said, his voice a deadly calm that sent a shiver down Jessica's spine. "Explain what, Jessica? How long you've been sneaking around with my father? How long you've been lying to my face? Our kids' faces. Do you even realize what you've done?" Tears welled in Jessica's eyes as she struggled to find the words, to justify the choices she'd made. "It wasn't supposed to happen this way. I never meant to hurt you, Michael. I never wanted to." He cut her off, his tone sharp. "Didn't want to hurt me? Jessica, you destroyed me. You destroyed this family." He shook his head, his face twisted with disbelief and disgust. "How could you? With him, of all people?" Jessica broke down, sobbing as she tried to piece together an apology, a weak explanation, something that might make this nightmare more bearable. But nothing she could say could fix what she had done, and deep down, she knew it. Every tear, every whispered plea for forgiveness only seemed to harden Michael's heart further. Unable to bear her excuses any longer, he stood abruptly, his hands clenched into fists. "We're done," he said, his voice flat and final. He turned on his heel and stormed out of the house, leaving Jessica alone with her guilt and despair, her cries echoing into the empty night. But Michael's anger didn't subside, it only grew. With nowhere else to go, he drove to his father's house, his mind a chaotic mix of rage and pain. Arriving at the darkened house, he pounded on the door, the force of his blows rattling the frame. Moments later, Henry answered, his expression shifting from surprise to alarm as he took in the wild look on his son's face. "Michael, what's going on?" Henry asked, his voice uncertain. "What's going on?" Michael spat, his voice dripping with venom. "You tell me, Henry. Tell me why you thought it was okay to betray me. To betray Mom's memory. How could you do this to your own son?" Henry's face paled, his eyes widening as he realized the confrontation he dreaded was finally upon him. "Michael, I never wanted to hurt you. I didn't plan this. It just happened," he said, struggling to find words, his voice faltering under his son's intense gaze. Michael's rage erupted. "It just happened. Do you even hear yourself?" He took a step forward, his body rigid, his fists clenched. "You were my father. You were supposed to protect this family, to be there for us, not do this." Henry raised his hands in a gesture of surrender, his voice pleading. "Please, Michael, let's talk about this. I know what I did was wrong. But please, don't let this tear us apart. We're still family. The word family struck Michael like a slap, fueling his anger even further. Family? He shouted, his voice breaking. You lost the right to call us that the minute you decided to betray us. You and Jessica, you're nothing to me now. The confrontation escalated, words turning to shouts, accusations flying between them, years of unspoken resentment and betrayal erupting in a torrent of anger. Neither man backed down, each one a reflection of the other's wounded pride and broken trust. The fight turned physical, the pain of betrayal boiling over as they grappled, the line between father and son blurring in their rage. Finally, Michael pulled away, breathing hard, his face twisted in fury. This isn't over, Henry, he said, his voice deadly calm. You think you can destroy my life, my family, and get away with it? His words lingered in the air like a threat, the promise of vengeance unmistakable. He left Henry standing in the doorway, his father's face etched with shock and regret, the shadows of their fight casting a darkness over what little remained of their bond. In the days following Michael's explosive confrontation, Jessica's world unraveled into a state of constant fear and dread. She felt like she was teetering on the edge of an abyss, each step more uncertain than the last. Michael's words, his icy rage, had left an indelible mark on her, and she knew that the storm was far from over. She had seen a part of him she had never seen before, a darkness, a fury that terrified her. Each night she lay awake, her mind racing with possibilities, each worse than the last. She could barely meet his gaze now, too ashamed and too afraid of what might happen next. Jessica turned to Sarah, her closest friend since college, the one person she could confide in without fear of judgment. They met at a small cafe tucked away in the quieter side of town, far from anyone who might recognize her. Jessica's hands shook as she clutched her coffee, her gaze flitting nervously around the room. Sarah watched her, concern etched deep in her face as Jessica finally began to speak, her voice barely more than a whisper. He knows everything, Sarah. About me, about Henry, Jessica said, her voice breaking as she uttered the words she had been avoiding, even in her own mind. I thought I could explain it to him, make him understand, but I saw his face. He looked at me like he didn't even recognize me. And he's so angry, Sarah. I've never seen him like this. Sarah's expression shifted from shock to a look of protective worry. Jessica, you have to think about your safety. If Michael is as angry as you say, there's no way to predict what he might do. And your kids, Jessica, you need to protect them, too. Jessica's eyes filled with tears as she nodded, the weight of her choices pressing down on her. I know. I know. I didn't want it to come to this. I didn't want to destroy my family, my children's lives. Her voice cracked, and she looked down, unable to meet Sarah's sympathetic gaze. I don't know how to fix this, Sarah. I don't know if it can be fixed. Sarah reached across the table, squeezing Jessica's trembling hand. Listen to me, Jessica. You need to think about yourself and the kids. If Michael is this furious, and if he's anything like you're describing, then you need a plan. Even if it means leaving. You can't stay in this situation, not if you're scared of him. The thought of leaving, of uprooting her children's lives, filled Jessica with a crushing sense of guilt and dread. How could she possibly explain to Emma and Lucas that they had to leave, that their home was no longer safe? She had already failed them by shattering their family, the thought of taking them away from everything they knew was almost unbearable. And yet, she knew Sarah was right. She couldn't ignore the fear that had taken hold of her, the cold certainty that Michael would not let this go. Jessica closed her eyes, trying to steady her breath. I don't know if I can do it, Sarah. Leaving would mean ending everything. How do I walk away from my marriage, from my life? Her voice was barely a whisper, each word a confession of a truth she hadn't been ready to face. Sarah's gaze softened, her voice firm yet gentle. Sometimes, Jessica, walking away is the only way to protect yourself. And your children. You need to think about them first. Whatever happens, they come first. Jessica knew her friend was right, but the reality of it felt overwhelming. She had spent so long keeping the affair a secret, convincing herself that she could somehow manage both lives, keep her family together despite the lies. But now, the facade had crumbled, and all that remained was the wreckage of her choices. Each time she looked at her children, she felt a pang of regret, a stab of guilt that seemed to deepen with each passing day. She had risked everything, and now the cost was becoming painfully clear. After parting with Sarah, Jessica drove aimlessly around the city, her thoughts spiraling as she tried to decide what to do next. The idea of leaving Jacksonville felt both terrifying and strangely freeing. A fresh start, away from the lies, the guilt, the betrayal, maybe that was what she and her children needed. But the thought of telling them, of explaining why their father was so angry, why they couldn't see their grandfather anymore, was more than she could bear. Returning home, Jessica felt her anxiety spike as she walked through the door, the familiar sounds of her home now tainted by the tension that seemed to cling to every room. She moved quietly, her footsteps soft, not wanting to provoke Michael's anger. But as she passed the living room, she felt his eyes on her, his gaze cold and unyielding. He said nothing, but the silence between them was suffocating, a heavy reminder that their marriage was now nothing more than a fragile ceasefire. In the days that followed, Jessica avoided being alone with Michael whenever she could, keeping her interactions brief and cautious. She clung to the routines of her children, each bedtime story, each packed lunch, an attempt to salvage some semblance of normalcy for their sake. But deep down, she knew that their lives would never be the same. As the reality of her situation settled in, Jessica finally began to understand that she could no longer delay the inevitable. Her choices had led her here, to a place where the only way forward was through the very thing she feared most, walking away, leaving behind everything she had built, everything she had tried so desperately to hold together. The rage that had been simmering within Michael since he'd first discovered the affair had grown into something dark, an obsession that began to take over his every waking moment. He could no longer look at Jessica without feeling the sharp sting of betrayal, nor think of his father without seeing the twisted images of their deceit. For days, he tried to numb himself, to focus on anything but the betrayal that had shattered his world. But the anger wouldn't subside, it only deepened, hardening into a resolve as cold as steel. The need for revenge began to consume him, filling the void that had been left in the wake of his family's destruction. Michael knew he couldn't act impulsively. If he were to exact the vengeance he craved, he needed to be smart, methodical. The pain they had inflicted on him was unforgivable, but he wouldn't let his emotions cloud his judgment. He had seen too many people lose control during his years of working with difficult clients, and he knew that if he wanted to truly make Jessica and Henry suffer, he needed a plan, a perfect, foolproof plan. In the quiet solitude of his garage, surrounded by the remnants of projects he had long abandoned, Michael began to gather the tools he would need. He spent hours researching, looking up every detail, making sure he understood how to cover his tracks, how to make his actions untraceable. The idea of leaving any traceable evidence made his stomach churn. No, he would be meticulous, leaving nothing behind that could tie him to what he was planning. He began by procuring a gun, a transaction he arranged through a connection on the fringes of the city, far away from anyone who might recognize him. The man he dealt with was a stranger, a shady figure who asked no questions, merely counting the cash Michael had handed over before placing the weapon in his hands. The gun was small, easily concealable, yet powerful enough to ensure his plan would go smoothly. Michael held it carefully, feeling the cold metal against his skin, a grim reminder of what lay ahead. Every night, after Jessica had fallen asleep, he would slip out to the garage, practicing his movements, rehearsing every step of his plan until it became second nature. He visualized each detail, each scenario, preparing himself for any possible obstacle. In his mind, he played out the night over and over again, the drive to his father's house, the approach through the quiet, darkened neighborhood, the swift, decisive moment when he would confront Henry. The thought of finally unleashing his anger, of confronting the man who had betrayed him in the most profound way, filled him with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in months. Jessica had no idea. She was careful around him, always watching her words, trying to keep her distance, her guilt evident in every move she made. But Michael no longer cared about her remorse or her apologies. In his eyes, her guilt was nothing more than a weak attempt at redemption, a futile effort to mend the chasm she had carved in their lives. His plan wasn't for her, it was for himself. It was the only way he could reclaim a sense of power, a way to make both of them pay for the betrayal that had torn his world apart. In the days leading up to the night he had chosen, Michael kept his routine unchanged, appearing calm and collected, hiding his true intentions beneath a facade of normalcy. He knew any sign of change in his behavior might arouse suspicion, so he continued to go to work, to smile and nod during meetings, even if every smile felt like a lie, every nod like a betrayal to himself. He went through the motions with Jessica, feigning interest in their children's day-to-day activities, acting as if nothing had happened, as if he hadn't already decided how their story would end. Finally, the night arrived. Michael had planned every detail down to the minute, every movement calculated and precise. He waited until Jessica was asleep, her breathing steady and deep, a stark contrast to the storm brewing inside him. He walked through the house silently, his footsteps careful as he retrieved the gun from its hiding place in the garage. He checked it one last time, feeling the weight of his decision settle over him like a shroud. As he drove to Henry's house, the streets were empty, the city cloaked in the quiet stillness of midnight. Each mile brought him closer to his goal, his heart steady, his mind clear. He had no doubts, no second thoughts. He had convinced himself that this was justice, that what he was about to do was simply the fulfillment of the punishment they both deserved. Parking a few houses down, he slipped on a pair of gloves, the leather fitting snugly over his hands as he gripped the gun. The house loomed ahead of him, dark and silent, its windows like hollow eyes watching his approach. He moved quickly, slipping through the side yard and approaching the back door where he knew Henry kept a spare key. The lock clicked softly as he turned it, the sound almost lost in the night, but to Michael, it was the signal he had been waiting for. As he stepped inside, the darkness swallowed him, the house eerily quiet, the faint hum of the refrigerator the only sound. He moved through the hall, his eyes adjusting to the shadows, his senses heightened. He could feel his pulse thundering in his chest, but his hands were steady, his resolve unbreakable. He found Henry in the living room, sitting in his favorite chair, unaware of the danger lurking just steps away. Michael paused, his breath catching as he took in the sight of his father, the man who had destroyed his life, who had stolen the future he had built. In that moment, all the rehearsed movements, all the careful planning, faded away, leaving only the raw, unfiltered rage that had fueled his every thought. Without a word, Michael raised the gun, his hand steady as he took aim. The silence stretched, the tension suffocating. And then, with a pull of the trigger, he finally released the anger that had consumed him. The gunshots reverberated through the darkened house, echoing off the walls like a final, haunting goodbye. Michael stood there, his hand still gripping the gun tightly, staring at the lifeless body of his father slumped in the armchair. Blood pooled around Henry, staining the worn upholstery and seeping into the floorboards, a dark reminder of the irrevocable path Michael had chosen. For a moment, he felt the weight of what he had done settle over him, a mix of triumph and hollowness. But he couldn't linger. He had planned this moment meticulously, and every detail now had to fall into place. Michael took a steadying breath, his mind shifting gears from vengeance to precision. He had to stage the scene to look like a robbery gone wrong, the kind of careless break-in that might happen on a quiet suburban street. He knew exactly how to arrange everything, every piece of the scene already mapped out in his mind. This was his last act in a story of betrayal, a final cover-up to ensure no one would ever link him to this act of violence. Moving swiftly, he wiped the gun down, erasing any trace of his fingerprints, before carefully placing it in Henry's hand, pressing it against his father's palm just enough to transfer oils, giving the illusion that Henry had handled it. He positioned Henry's hand as if he had grabbed the gun in defense, as if he'd struggled with an intruder before ultimately losing. Every touch, every motion, was calculated to leave behind only the clues Michael wanted anyone to find. He scanned the room, taking in every detail, every piece that might tell a story he hadn't intended. He walked to the small desk where Henry kept his papers and opened drawers, rifling through them roughly to create the appearance of a desperate search. He scattered a few papers on the floor, tipping over a chair as if someone had fought and struggled. Next, he moved to the bookshelf and pulled out a few books, tossing them carelessly onto the ground, leaving them in disarray. Everything had to look spontaneous, chaotic, as though some petty thief had invaded, searching for valuables without any regard for the life that had been taken. In the hallway, he found Henry's wallet on the side table and pocketed a few bills before throwing the wallet onto the floor, open and partially emptied. It would look as if the supposed intruder had taken what they could in a hurry, fleeing the scene after a panicked attempt to find valuables. Michael even knocked over a lamp, its shattered glass scattering across the floor, adding an element of struggle to the fabricated scene. Every movement was cold and calculated, devoid of the rage that had fueled him just moments before. Now, he was nothing more than a man finishing a task, ensuring that every last detail fit the story he wanted the police to believe. He checked the room one final time, ensuring that nothing seemed out of place, no trace of his presence, no hint of his true motive. Everything had to point toward a careless, senseless act of violence by a stranger who had left no trace of themselves. When he was satisfied, he moved to the sink, carefully washing his hands and discarding the gloves he'd worn, hiding them beneath the sink in a cabinet where he knew they'd be overlooked in a standard search. The gun he left with Henry, wiping it clean one last time to make sure no fingerprints remained. He knew enough from his father's stories as a police officer to understand how crime scenes were processed, the angles investigators would take, the subtle things they'd look for. He'd made sure to leave none of them. As he prepared to leave, he paused by the front door, his heart thudding in his chest as he took one last look around the room, the broken pieces of his father's life scattered across the floor. The once warm living room, a place he'd known all his life, was now a scene of chaos and tragedy, carefully designed to mask the truth of his actions. The sight brought a strange sense of closure, the final step in a journey he'd never imagined taking but that felt, in this moment, inevitable. He slipped out the door, careful to close it quietly behind him, the chill of the night air hitting him as he walked down the street toward his car, parked a safe distance away. He didn't rush, didn't look back. Every step felt heavy, each one a reminder of the life he had just ended, the man who had once been his father but who had become, in the end, nothing more than a betrayal he needed to erase. Back in his car, he sat in silence, his hands still steady, his heartbeat slowly returning to a normal rhythm. He had done it. The scene was set, the story crafted just as he'd envisioned. In the eyes of anyone who found Henry, it would appear as though he'd been the unfortunate victim of a desperate, violent crime. Michael took one last deep breath, feeling the satisfaction of a plan executed to perfection mingled with an emptiness that he hadn't anticipated. The justice he'd sought, the revenge he'd orchestrated, it was done, and yet the weight remained, pressing down on him as he started the car and drove away from the house that now held nothing but silence and secrets. As he made his way back home, the streetlights casting long shadows across the road, Michael felt the finality of his actions settling in. He had taken the vengeance he'd craved, meticulously covered every trace. But as he pulled into his driveway and stepped out of the car, he couldn't escape the strange hollowness that followed him. The morning after the murder, Jessica's day began with the mundane rituals of breakfast and school drop-offs, entirely unaware of the storm brewing. Her life, already fragile and teetering on the edge, was about to shatter in ways she hadn't imagined. As she prepared breakfast, there was a knock at the door. The sound startled her, the unexpected intrusion stirring up the anxiety that had become her constant companion since Michael's discovery of her affair. She opened the door to find two police officers standing on the porch, their expressions somber and serious. "Mrs. Monroe?" one of them asked gently. Jessica nodded, her heart pounding as dread crept over her. "We're sorry to inform you that Henry Monroe was found dead in his home early this morning. It appears to have been a robbery gone wrong." The words seemed to blur together as they sank in. Her vision swam, her grip on the doorframe tightening as she tried to process the news. Henry, dead. It was a reality that seemed impossible, unfathomable. Her mind reeled, racing back over their final moments together, the betrayal that had cost them both so much. In the days that followed, the Jacksonville Police Department launched a full investigation into Henry's death. While the initial assessment suggested a botched robbery, the lead detective, John Harris, an experienced investigator known for his thoroughness, felt something was off. Harris had known Henry from his days on the force, respected him as a dedicated officer, and knew that he wouldn't have been an easy target. The scene at the house, though staged to look chaotic, felt forced, deliberate. The sense of disorder seemed almost too perfect, a detail Harris's seasoned eye couldn't overlook. As Detective Harris and his team combed through the evidence, they began uncovering inconsistencies that deepened their suspicions. Fingerprints were scarce, too few for an actual struggle, and Henry's wallet, though emptied, still contained an ID and credit cards. The supposed thief had taken only a few bills, leaving behind valuable items that a desperate intruder would likely have stolen. The pieces didn't add up, the randomness of the supposed robbery undermined by the calculated nature of each misplaced item. Then came the discovery that shifted the entire direction of the investigation. While going through Henry's belongings, they stumbled upon a small, locked drawer in his desk. Inside, they found a series of photographs, the very same ones Michael had received from the private investigator. The photos revealed Henry and Jessica together in various locations, a quiet cafe, a distant motel, moments captured in secret, damning evidence of their affair. Detective Harris looked over the images, his suspicions growing. The affair added a new layer of complexity to the case, casting doubt on the initial theory of a random burglary. The detective summoned Jessica for questioning, her distress palpable as she entered the sterile confines of the police station. She sat across from Harris, visibly shaken, her face pale as she tried to maintain her composure. Harris didn't waste time, he laid the photographs on the table, one by one, letting Jessica absorb the gravity of what they'd found. Her reaction was immediate, a sharp intake of breath as her eyes fell on the images, her gaze flickering between the photos and Harris's unyielding stare. She looked cornered, her hands trembling as she struggled to find words. I don't know how you got those, she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. But it wasn't supposed to be like this. We never wanted to hurt anyone. Harris leaned forward, his gaze piercing. Mrs. Monroe, we need the truth. This isn't about the affair itself, it's about your connection to Henry's murder. If there's something you're hiding, now is the time to come clean. Jessica broke down, tears streaming down her face as she tried to explain herself, her words tumbling out in fragments, a blend of guilt and desperation. She admitted to the affair, her voice barely audible, recounting the years of secrecy, the hidden meetings, and the painful reality that had ultimately been exposed. But she denied any involvement in Henry's death, her pleas laced with sincerity, even as Harris studied her with a skeptic's eye. As the investigation continued, Harris's attention turned to Michael. He had been Henry's only living relative and had obvious motive, given the betrayal by his father and wife. Michael was summoned to the station, his demeanor composed but his eyes reflecting the weight of recent events. He gave a carefully controlled alibi, stating that he'd been at home alone the night of the murder. He presented it with the calm of someone who had prepared, his voice steady, but Harris detected an undercurrent of tension, a crack in the veneer of Michael's control. The detectives dug deeper, searching Michael's car and home for any physical evidence that might link him to the crime. In the garage, they found a pair of gloves hidden among old tools, tucked away in a forgotten corner. Although the gloves had been cleaned, forensic testing revealed faint traces of gunpowder residue embedded in the fabric, a subtle, nearly invisible mark that tied Michael to the weapon used to kill Henry. It was a small piece of evidence, but it was enough to open a new line of inquiry. The breakthrough prompted further scrutiny. Investigators began piecing together Michael's recent activities, tracing his interactions, examining phone records, and revisiting every possible connection to the crime. The gloves, combined with his tense alibi and motive, created a pattern that grew increasingly difficult for him to deny. Detectives were relentless, questioning Michael again, chipping away at his composure with each carefully phrased question. As the pressure mounted, Michael's stoic facade began to crack. The weight of the evidence, the relentless probing of Harris and his team, wore him down. He had spent weeks plotting the perfect revenge, planning each detail meticulously, but the guilt and isolation had taken their toll. In a moment of weakness, he let slip a crucial detail, a timeline inconsistency that caught Harris's attention, a misstep that unraveled his story. Confronted with the mounting evidence, Michael felt the walls closing in. He tried to deny it, his voice growing strained as he clung to the remnants of his alibi. But the detectives had cornered him, his words betraying the desperation of a man who knew he had lost. They watched as his bravado crumbled, his carefully constructed defenses falling apart under the relentless pressure. It was over. The evidence left no doubt, and Michael's silence as he was led away spoke louder than any confession. The truth of his actions, the pain of betrayal that had driven him to murder, were now laid bare, exposed for the world to see. The trial that followed was swift and brutal, a painful spectacle for those who had once looked up to the Monroe family as a model of respectability. News of the affair, the betrayal, and the murder swept through Jacksonville like wildfire, the sordid details of the case captivating the city. Michael Monroe, a man who had once been admired for his charm and success, now sat in the defendant's chair, his face drawn, his eyes hollow. His carefully crafted life lay in ruins, destroyed by the very vengeance he had so meticulously planned. The prosecution wasted no time in laying out the details of the case. They presented the evidence in precise, cutting terms, the affair between Jessica and Henry, the hidden photos, the staged crime scene, and, finally, the gloves with gunpowder residue that had tied Michael to the murder weapon. Each piece was woven into a narrative of betrayal and revenge, painting Michael as a man driven to the edge by jealousy and rage. The photos, the gloves, and his inconsistent alibi all worked against him, an undeniable chain of events that led to only one conclusion. Jessica sat quietly in the back of the courtroom, her face pale and tear-streaked as she listened to each damning piece of evidence. She felt the weight of the tragedy pressing down on her, a suffocating guilt she could neither escape nor explain. This was her doing, her choices had set off a chain reaction that had destroyed everything she had once valued. She watched as the prosecution showed the photos of her with Henry, each one a reminder of her mistakes, each one a public exhibition of her private shame. The defense attempted to paint Michael as a man temporarily driven to madness, a husband who had lost his mind in the face of unbearable betrayal. They argued that the affair had shattered him, leaving him unable to act rationally, but the jury was unmoved. Michael's actions hadn't been those of a man in a sudden rage, they had been calculated, planned, executed with a cold precision that belied any notion of temporary insanity. His calm demeanor, his meticulous staging of the crime scene, only served to underscore his intent. Throughout the trial, Michael sat in silence, his gaze fixed forward, his expression one of resignation. The once vibrant man, who had built a successful career and a beautiful family, was now nothing more than a hollow shell, broken by his own pursuit of vengeance. He offered no apologies, no explanations, as the prosecution laid bare his sins. To him, the trial was merely a formality, the final chapter in a story that had been destined to end in tragedy. In the end, the jury returned with a swift verdict, guilty of first-degree murder. Michael Monroe was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The courtroom was silent as the judge handed down the sentence, each word a final nail in the coffin of his former life. The verdict was a relief to some, justice to others, but to Michael, it was nothing more than an echo of the emptiness that had consumed him since the night he had pulled the trigger. Jessica's life, too, was irrevocably changed. In the days following the trial, she filed for divorce, determined to put as much distance as possible between herself and the ruins of her marriage. She couldn't escape the shame that now defined her, couldn't undo the damage her choices had inflicted. With her children in tow, she left Jacksonville, seeking a fresh start in a new town where no one knew her name, where no one would look at her with the judgment and pity she saw in the eyes of everyone she passed. But even as she tried to rebuild her life, the memories haunted her. Every quiet moment, every glance at her children, brought back flashes of the life she had destroyed. She had been searching for comfort, for understanding, and had lost herself in a web of lies and deceit that had cost her everything. Now, she was left with only fragments of a life she could never piece back together, and the knowledge that her children would grow up carrying the shadow of their father's crime and their mother's mistakes. Michael, now alone in a prison cell, found himself haunted by the same memories. The betrayal that had once fueled his rage now left him hollow, a constant reminder of the life he had thrown away. He spent his days in silence, the walls of his cell closing in around him, the faces of his family haunting him in the quiet hours of the night. He had wanted revenge, had craved the satisfaction of making his wife and father pay for their betrayal, but he found no peace in his punishment, no satisfaction in the life sentence that stretched before him. The Monroes, once a proud and respected family, were now nothing more than a tragic tale, a cautionary story whispered through the streets of Jacksonville. Friends and neighbors spoke of them in hushed tones, recalling the warmth and laughter that had once filled their home, now replaced by silence and sorrow. In the end, there were no victors, no redemption, only the painful remnants of a life torn apart by choices made in the shadows. For Jessica and Michael, there would be no closure, no final act of forgiveness. Their lives had been shattered by a betrayal that could never be mended, each of them condemned to carry the weight of their actions alone.